Hello, folks. This is Andrew Gilmore with another episode of Mostly Movies, Maybe Music. I probably should explain that there are some people outside my house doing construction right now, so you might hear some extra noise. I'm not sure if the microphone is going to pick that up, but anyway, that's your explanation if there are extra noises there. But it's been a while since I've done one of these shows, and it is kind of a slow process to book guests, but I do have two shows coming up this week, and like they say, it's quality over quantity, so I try to strive for that. And I certainly have a quality guest today, and his name is Randy Skretvedt. And Randy is a pop culture historian. He knows a lot about classic movies and old time radio and music and television and so on. He's also a radio performer. He's been the host of his own radio show for more than 40 years, and that's certainly something, excuse me, my tongue isn't working. That's certainly something that we'll talk about during the course of the conversation.
Okay.
And he's also a writer in various forms. Most notably, he has written several books about the films of Laurel and Hardy, which is a particular passion of his. Going way back, I think Randy probably knows more about Laurel and Hardy than just about anybody. So,
Oh, I don't know about that. I have my little niche. Let me just say that. Okay.
well, you're definitely in the top two or three people on that subject for
All
sure.
right. All right.
So, well, technically, the guest isn't supposed to start talking until after I've introduced you, but that's okay.
I'll be quiet and pretend that I didn't say anything.
Well, and maybe don't say anything for the rest of the interview after that one. I don't know. Anyway, no, I'm just fooling around now. But Randy's been a good friend. We've known each other through Facebook for quite a while. I think we first connected in 2012 or something that far back. So it's been a while, and he's a great guy, and I'm happy to know him. And the only time that we've actually spoken face to face was during the pandemic. I was teaching some film classes through Zoom and doing some Laurel and Hardy screenings there. And Randy was nice enough to Zoom in with us and introduce the films and do some Q&A with my students and that kind of thing. So that was an interesting experience. And that was a few years ago, of course. So we haven't actually seen each other since then. So it's a pleasure to be able to do that again. And I'm sure we'll have a good conversation today. So, Randy, thank you so much for giving me some of your time today. I'm happy to have you here.
Thank you for having me on the show, and it's nice to remake your acquaintance on the through the miracle of Zoom.
Yes. So I was telling you before we tend to jump around to different topics, but of course I have my record collection there behind me, which we were just talking about a minute ago. So I guess we should excuse me, my tongue is going again there. I guess we should start with music. So tell me how you got started listening to old jazz records and collecting 78s.
Well, everything seems to bounce back to Laurel and Hardy with me. When I was a very young kid, I was watching the Laurel and Hardy films on Channel 9 out here in Los Angeles, and they had the wonderful music by Leroy Shield and some by Marvin Hatley,
Yes.
and I loved those cues, those background themes. And I thought there's got to be music like that on the records. I was already a record collector. I mean, I had the usual kiddie records that were on Peter Pan or Cricket or or Little Golden records. I still have those records that I've had ever since I was 3 or 4 years old. But there was another show on Los Angeles TV, a guy named Lloyd Thaxton, and
Yes.
he was sort of the local low budget version of American Bandstand with Dick Clark. Now, since they normally couldn't afford to have guests on the show, they did once in a while, and they would lip sync to their records. In fact, I remember one time they had Bill Cosby on, and he had to lip sync to the record of Noah building the Ark. I thought that was kind of weird. Anyway, Lloyd would do these funny pantomimes, these funny sketches to whatever the top 40 hit records were at the time. And I watched it because he was really funny. He did a lot of great visual comedy, but of course, I soon got hooked into the world of top 40 music. So, when I was 3 and 4 years old, my mother would say, well, honey, my mother worked in Long Beach, and she'd say, honey, I'm going to go into town today. Are there any records you want me to buy for you? And I'd say, yeah, I want Surfin' by the Beach Boys. I want Surfer Stump by the Marquettes. I want Roses Are Red by Bobby Vinton. And I want Watermelon Man by Mongo Santa Maria. And she would find them. She always found them for me. So my record collection as a little kid was very eclectic because I had Felix the Cat and Popeye on Peter Pan, and then I had Mongo Santa Maria doing Watermelon Man on Battle on a 45. So anyway, I got into contemporary pop music very, very young, but I got into the 20s and 30s music through Laurel and Hardy and loving that kind of music. My parents had a bunch of 78s, but they were swing era. They had a beautiful Buff Bluebird of Ozzie Nelson doing You Can't Run Away from Love Tonight. And I liked that one a lot. I was running the record player. There's a great photograph of me at age 2, already looking in our record player and just being mesmerized by the record spinning around. So I responsibly worked the record player when I was 3 years old. I didn't break anything. And saw these great 78s, and of course, the look of them and the feel of them and the great old artwork on the labels was fascinating. And before too much longer, I realized that if you went to a Salvation Army store, they would have stacks and stacks of these 78 RPM records for 25 cents a piece. And so after a while, you learn that certain labels have the music that you like, or you start to learn the names of certain band leaders. And so by the time I was 8 or 9 years old, I was focusing on Ted Weems and George Olson and certain things by Paul Whiteman. I learned to look for Foxtrot. I wasn't crazy about the waltzes, but if it said Foxtrot, and if it had a Victor Scroll label on it, that was going to be good. And, you learn these things when those records were available back then for virtually nothing. So I amassed a pretty good collection of 78s before too much longer. And I started doing the radio show when I was in junior college back in, let's see, about 1978 or 79. No, yeah, 78 or 79 at Fullerton College, which had a wonderful 20-watt radio station and still does, KBPK, the mighty FM 90. And I did that show there for 3 years. And then I was off the air for about a month. And it was October of 1982. A friend of mine named Bob Lines, who has had many different shows in the Los Angeles market devoted to old-time radio, he said, "Randy, I've got 4 shows and it's one too many for me." He said, I just signed on a couple of months back with KSPC at Pomona College, and I just don't have the time to do that 4th show. Do you want to take it over? Because my show is 3 hours, and the first and third hour are vintage music, and the middle hour is golden age radio, because I want to cover the whole gamut of audible entertainment. So I said, yeah, absolutely. So I called the lady who was the station manager, and I sent her a demo tape, and she said, yeah, we like it, come on down. So I got hired at KSPC. Of course, I don't make a dime from it, but I've been there ever since October of 1982. And
you are getting ahead of me. I was going to ask you about your radio show later, but that's okay.
Okay, well, it's called Forward into the Past. It's 3 hours, and the first and third hour are vintage music, usually from between 1925 or 19 through 1945. But I do cover some of the periods before and after that, if the record is particularly interesting. And I try to put sets together that where 3 or 4 records or 5 records together will tell a story by the combination of the record. I learned that skill from listening to Dr. Demento. He was a past master at sequencing songs together in a set so that they make sense or tell a story. So I try to have 4 or 5 records in a set that are grouped by some shared element.
Right. I used to work in college radio, and I did that kind of thing myself, so I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it could be a storyline. It could be a shared musical instrument. It could be a particular genre of music. Although I try to mix them up within sets, because I play hot jazz from the 20s. I play swing music, some blues, some fiddle bands from the late 20s, comedy records, movie soundtracks, all sorts of things. So whatever was being produced during that time, primarily in America and in Britain, is fair game. Although there are times when I bring in records from Latin America too.
Right. So when you started collecting, were there specific records that really impressed you? Was there something that you heard where you went, wow, I've never heard anything like this?
Well, I'll tell you the story of my very favorite record. My relatives all are from northern Minnesota. That's where my parents grew up, in a little town called Gary, Minnesota, which at its peak had about 300 people. I think for some reason it always seems to have 300 people. It never gets any bigger or smaller. And we were there on vacation in 1968, in the summer of 68. And my dad wanted to go to where his parents' farm had been. Nobody was working. It was abandoned by this point because they had moved on. And so he and one of his brothers said, "Oh, let's go up in the hayloft and see what we find." And they came back down with this stack of records, and they all turned out to be dance band records from the late 20s because we brought them home, we washed them because they were pretty dirty, and then we played them. And one of them, it's a red shellac record on Domino. Domino
Mm.
was a dime store label. I don't remember exactly which dime store it was sold at, but it was one of the Plaza labels. Plaza was based in New York, and they did these records that sold for 35 cents as opposed to the expensive 75-cent records that were on Columbia and Victor. They were not pressed on great shellac. They were not very well recorded, but boy, the music can be really, really hot. And there's one called Just the Same, which was recorded by a lot of different people. But this one is credited to the Hollywood Dance Orchestra. I later found out this was a group that was put together by a guy named Adrian Schubert. He was the contractor for the Plaza group of labels. So you might be familiar with some of these labels. It's Domino,
Yes.
Apex, Regal, Banner, and in Canada there was also Compo and Microphone. And the same recording, the same master recording could be issued on all of those labels, usually credited to different bands, but it would be the very same exact recording. So as it turns out later on, the copy that I had of Just the Same by the Hollywood Dance Orchestra was kind of rough, and it took me years and years to find a better one, but I did ultimately find one. And this one, I think, is on Regal, and it's credited to the Imperial Dance Orchestra. But it's the very same master. It's the same record. So I don't care what the label says. And this one is on black shellac, not red shellac like the Domino one is. So it's just a really wonderful, hot arrangement. I know that it was recorded in April of 1927 because I have the Brian Rust American Dance Band discography books. So it has a little information on it, but I don't think it has anything specific about who the specific musicians are. I wish I knew because there's a really hot clarinetist on it, and I wish I knew who did the arrangement because there are several other records of that song, but none of them comes close to this one for sheer musical heat. So that's my favorite record, found by my dad in a hayloft in Gary, Minnesota in 1968.
Wow. Yeah. So then it's obvious from what you've been saying that you know a lot of details about old records. And when you started, how did you find information and dig deeper into what you were listening to?
There weren't a lot of sources, really. You know, there are a lot of books about old movies, and there are a fair number of books about old radio. There still are not a whole bunch of books about old records uh, until I discovered Brian Rust. And
Yes.
you know, Brian Rust was to records what Kevin Brownlow is to silent movies. I mean, he's
Yes.
like the one man historian and savior of these things. So he came out with a whole bunch of different discographies, and I bought his American Dance Band discography book. I was probably about 22 when I found that. And he also had one that was devoted to jazz. There's also one called the Victor Master Book, which is particularly helpful because it has other things besides dance bands. It's got basically everything that Victor released from 1925 through 1935. So that's helpful for other kinds of records. So, yeah, there are a few reference books, but I'll tell you, I learned a lot about all of this because I got to meet a guy named Arnold Brillhart. Now, Arnold Brillhart was a top alto saxophonist and clarinetist in New York. He also played the flute and the oboe, so he was an all around reed man. And I met Arnold just before he turned 90.
Wow.
And so he was born September 30th of 1904, if I remember correctly. Yeah, September 30th of 1904. So I met him in September of 1994. And the great thing about him was he was absolutely unencumbered by age. You would never have guessed that he was 90 years old because he would talk to me like I'm talking to you right now. And he had a great retentive memory and had a great story about all these New York musicians that he'd worked with. If you look in the dance band discography book in the index for names, he's got practically a whole column to himself because he made so many records. And he not only did records, but he did radio shows and worked in Broadway pit orchestras. So he was all over the New York music scene. He was probably the second call alto and clarinet man after Jimmy Dorsey.
Hmm.
And so he was, you know, right there in the thick of things. and a wonderful, genial man, and had great stories. And every time I came to visit him or talk to him on the phone, I had a tape recorder running because he would undoubtedly have wonderful stories, and I wanted to make sure they got preserved. There's a couple of things of him on YouTube too. There's a couple of interviews with him that are on YouTube. But anyway, I learned a lot about the nuts and bolts of being a musician in New York in those days. In fact, talking about Addie Schubert, the guy who did just the same, I talked to him. I said, "Well, you must have worked for him." He said, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah." He said, "I worked for everybody." And he said, Addie Schubert was the contractor for those Plaza labels. And he said, he used to record in these weird little recording studios on the outskirts of town. He said, Victor and Columbia were right smack in the heart of Manhattan. And I lived in Yonkers, and I would take the subway to Manhattan, and it was very easy to go. Sometimes I would go in one day from Columbia to Victor and back again, doing 3 sessions or more in a given day. But he said, Addie Schubert recorded in these weird little studios on the outskirts of town. So usually if I got a call from Addie Schubert, I'd send a sub. So that was his story about that. And he said, he said, there's all these names of dance bands on these records, like the Manhattan Dance Makers and the Broadway Broadcasters and everything. He said the record companies came up with those because they didn't want the public to know that 90% of the records were made by about 24 guys. Right. He says, we were doing everything. And he says, yes, there were actual name bands like Paul Whiteman or George Olsen that would tour, and that's usually that band on the record. He says, although sometimes there would be a time when they had to get a record date out and they were on tour somewhere, and so sometimes we would make a record and it would be released under the name of George Olsen, but usually if it was a name band like that, it would be the real band. In fact, I remember there is actually a time where Ben Selvin at Columbia put out another band under Paul Whiteman's name, and Whiteman got very angry about it. So there is an example of that. But anyway, I learned a lot of things from Arnold. I still have all the tapes of him talking, and he was a wonderful education as well as being a terrific friend.
Wow. Yeah, those are good stories. I'm glad you shared that. So I guess, you were talking before about having too many records. So I guess this is kind of a question the collectors ask each other. How do you organize your collection?
I have a barn in my backyard. My dear dad got tired of seeing me trip over wooden crates that were filled with LPs and 78s. He said, we got all that space in the backyard. We had a shuffleboard court. There was a big cement slab in the backyard that had been a shuffleboard court, but nobody was playing shuffleboard anymore. He said, why don't we get the Tough Shed people to build you a barn for your records? So thanks, Dad. That's a great idea. So this is back in 2003. We built a barn. It's 12 feet wide, 28 feet long. And I told the guys, I said, now I'm going to have a lot of very heavy records in here because 78s weigh a ton. And he said, okay. He said, we put metal supports underneath the wooden floorboard. We'll put double the number of metal supports. It'll be solid metal under there. And that'll, keep the floorboards from warping or cracking or breaking under the weight of the records. So I have a nicely reinforced barn, and we put in drywall, and I patched it all up and painted it and put carpeting and have bookshelves on both sides. One side is mostly 78s. The other side is mostly LPs with a little ribbon of CDs going all around the room. And the LPs I just do alphabetically. Mm-hmm. Well, actually, if it's various artists, it starts off with historical things like voices of great people from 1900 and so on. Then it's World War I records, then World War II records. Then I think I have Broadway shows, then movie soundtracks, then comedy collections. Let's see what else. There's a whole section devoted to ragtime. And within that, a subsection devoted to piano rolls, because there are a lot of piano roll records. Right. And then after a while, there's part that are Western swing collections and blues and other rural music. These are all various artists' collections. And then after that, it goes alphabetically, probably going from Irving Aronson all the way to Bob Zerke. Right. And then, of course, at one point, that was the whole thing. Everything fit very neatly in all those bookshelves. But of course, over the years, I have acquired more. So I have some file boxes of other things which are alphabetical that are on the floor of the barn. And I think I'm going to have to put in another row of shelves in the middle of the floor because I just have acquired too much. So that's that. And then the 78s, I have the dance bands are all by themselves alphabetically, but then I have sections devoted to Irving Kaufman and Billy Murray
Right.
and the Happiness Boys and various entertainers from that period who made lots and lots of records. So they should have a little section all by themselves. And then I keep the big band separate from the 20s dance bands. There is a kind of a little period there in 1933-34 where you're kind of going, which way does this go? But I kind of figure that swing really starts about 1935.
Right.
And prior to that, it's hot dance bands going up to 1930, and then right after the crash, it became smooth and sweet dance bands
Right.
when everybody was suffering the hangover from the wild party that they'd had in the late 1920s.
Right.
So that's, yeah, I do keep things organized so that I can find them because, as my friend Jim Bedoyan, who runs Take Two Records, he said, well, if you can't find it, you don't own it.
Right.
And that's very true. So I try to make sure I can find it.
Yeah. What would you say is the rarest record you have?
Well, I was gifted with a bunch of beautiful original Bix Beiderbecke okays
Wow.
many years ago. We had a mutual friend, another great musician named Marvin Hatley.
Yes.
And Marvin was the musical director for the Hal Roach Studios. And he worked alongside Leroy Shield, who's the guy who did all those cues that we hear in the early 30s, Laurel and Hardy Shorts and the Little Rascals and Charlie Chase. Marvin actually did the arrangements and hired the musicians. He would get a lead sheet from Leroy Shield, which is basically just a notation of the melody line. And I have a bunch of those that Marvin gave me. I've got
Hmm.
Leroy Shield lead sheets. So the peculiar characteristic of those lovely cues with the alto saxes and the instrumentation, a lot of that is Marvin Hatley's work, even
Right.
though he may not have been the composer. And he did, of course, compose later on for Way Out West and Blockheads and the later Laurel and Hardy features and other features too, like Captain Fury. But anyway, he was a great musician, a wonderful guy. I got to meet him at a Sons of the Desert meeting when I was 12 years old in August of 1971. He was there at the meeting and playing hot stride piano like Fats Waller. And I loved Fats Waller, so I was immediately captivated by him. And we became very good friends. And in fact, in 1982, when I was still in college, I produced a record album with Marvin because I
Yes.
thought he should be recorded and preserved. He was still such a great musician. And he'd said for years, well, I have a bunch of old scratchy records of things that I recorded for Roach, but nobody'd be interested in those. I said, oh, yes, we would. I don't care how scratchy they are. Yes, we would. So he finally brought them down, and they were glass transcriptions because they had been made during World War II when metal was being rationed, and they made records on glass. And you look cross-eyed at those things and they will break. So I was very nervous about those. But I had a friend through another nostalgia organization called Spurdvac. Spurdvac
Yes.
is the old-time radio group. Okay, there was a guy involved with that club named Ken Greenwald, and he had access to all of these great equipment that was down in the basement of the Home Savings Building on Sunset and Vine, which had formerly been NBC. It had been the beautiful NBC building, and they bulldozed it and had put up a Home Savings. But in the basement, they still had a bunch of microphones and turntables and equipment. They had file cabinets galore filled with magazines devoted to radio and 8x10s of all these radio people. I think all of that stuff now is at UC Santa Barbara. They have acquired all of that. So I would love to go up there and pour through all that sometime. Anyway, Ken knew how to tickle all the sound out of Marvin's transcriptions. We made a 15-inch per second full track mono tape of them. I found a place in Orange County that did record mastering, and it cost me $1,726 to make 1,000 copies of an album with Marvin Hatley. I had some college scholarship money that I didn't need. Back then, college was cheap. I paid $114 each semester. That was my college
Hmm.
tuition. So I'd won a couple of scholarships and I didn't need the money, but so I used it for the Marvin Hatley album. And we made 1,000 copies, each one numbered by me and signed by him. And we sold them out very quickly. They still show up from time to time on eBay. The first side of it is all original Hal Roach stuff from the 30s, and the second side is new tracks that we made. I had a college chum named Scott Comerford, whose dad had been a radio comedy writer. He back in the 40s, and he had a multi-track reel-to-reel recorder that could do overdubbing, like Les Paul and Mary Ford. And so we overdubbed Marvin playing piano, celeste, tuba, trumpet, drums, and accordion, and singing songs that he'd written. So he is a one-man band on these recordings. So I was so happy to get that. I think that's still my proudest achievement of anything I've ever done, is
Sure.
getting Marvin Hatley preserved on a record, because I love the man so much. He was kind of mystical. He was sort of a part country boy because he was from Oklahoma, and part guru. And he grew almost all of his own food. He was always in his garden. He lived in a house at the very tippy top of the Hollywood Hills, 7425 Woodrow Wilson Drive.
Hmm.
And he lived right at the top, and he had built this house himself. And it was wonderful for him, but absolutely unlivable for anybody else, because, it had this huge music room. He had this loft in front where he built and designed these incredible speakers, which just got volume like you wouldn't believe. He said, "Yeah, I found a new way to organize the sound waves." I said, "Marvin, you got to patent that. You could be rich if you just patent this new process of yours." And there was a motif all going through the walkway of the Trilon and Perisphere from the 1939 World's Fair, and each block of cement took you through history and gave you a history lesson. So you went from the ancient Greeks with a quote from one of the ancient Greeks, and then the Trilon and Perisphere, and then you went to Rome, and then you went to the Renaissance, and finally the last step before the front door was 1962, which is when he built the house, and it was a quote from John Glenn. And the Trilon and Perisphere. And then when you went into the room, he had stained glass built into the wall. And so at a certain time during the day, the sun would come through and this beautiful color would imbue the living room. So he was a brilliant man, kind of an odd man, but brilliant. And the fun thing is, when his wife was still alive, his wife was named Josephine, and she was very garrulous, very talkative. And she would oftentimes say, "Marvin, tell the story about so-and-so." And Marvin would get 5 words into it, and she would take over and tell the story for him. But when you went to Marvin's house, she would greet you and she'd say, "Oh, sounds like Marvin and his friends are having a jam session. Well, I bet they're all having a lot of fun. Let's go in and see them." And she'd take you into the music room, and it was Marvin all alone playing hot stride jazz piano with his left hand, like Fats Waller, playing a bass trumpet with his right hand, and playing a drum contraption that he had designed and built with his feet. And it sounded like 3 people. So that was always the joke whenever you came to Marvin's house the first time. Well, anyway, that's Marvin Hatley was wonderful. I got to know him for 15 years before he died in 1986. I made the album with him, and he was. I still would like to see some of his music get recorded, as the Leroy Shield music has been recorded by the Bohunks, because now his scores are more elaborate because he had 35 musicians, so they are full orchestral scores. But the music that he wrote for Way Out West and Blockheads and Saps at Sea and A Chump at Oxford is absolutely gorgeous and really should be newly recorded. So,
Yeah.
next.
So, well, you kind of brought me around to one of my other questions, which is speaking of these people that you met. I mean, I know you met a lot of people who worked with Laurel and Hardy and people who worked in old time radio and so on. And
Yeah.
I was wondering how you prepared your questions back in those days before Google. How did you do your research when you were interviewing someone?
Well, of course, happily there were other sorts. We somehow survived and had perpetuated history before Google. Um, Well, of course, I had the when I was 9 years old, my mother for Christmas gave me the John McCabe, Mr. Laurel and Mr. Hardy book, and the William K. Everson, The Films of Laurel and Hardy book. I had no idea that these existed, but my mother was a very smart woman, and she'd gone to the bookstore and had asked if there was anything on Laurel and Hardy, and sure enough, these books had just come out. So I got them for Christmas of 1967. So I had that as a foundation, and basically, I learned some things from going to Sons of the Desert meetings, because I
Right.
joined Sons of the Desert in 1971 when I was 12. And God bless my dad for taking me all the way into North Hollywood once a month for those meetings, because I got to meet a lot of people who wouldn't be around too many years after that. I was a little frustrated at the beginning because the first meeting I was at, they said, "Well, we have some special guests here." It was almost all men in those days, about 60 guys, middle-aged guys. And they said, "Well, we have some special people here. We have Stan Laurel's second wife, Ruth. Stand up, Ruth." And she'd stand up and wave and sit down. "And we have Joe Rock, who produced 12 Stan Laurel comedies before Stan got together with Babe. Stand up, Joe. And Joe would stand up to his full 4'9" and wave. And then we have Marvin Hatley, who did music at the Laurel and Hardy films at the Roach Studios. Stand up, Marvin. And then we'd watch Hog Wild. And I was thinking, why are we watching Hog Wild, which I'll bet all of us could recite or have certainly seen many times, when these people are in the room and we're not interviewing them? What's going on here? So I began taking a cassette recorder to meetings and doing little impromptu things with these people. And then when I was finally got my driver's license, then I did interviews, in earnest. Everybody lived about 40 miles away from me, usually in Studio City or North Hollywood or Encino or somewhere in the valley. And Los Angeles freeways even then were a terror. So it was never real easy for me to get there, but I could do it. And of course, when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I had a lot more gumption and get up and go and determination to get these people preserved on tape before they died. So, I did a lot of interviews. Most of my interviews I did in 1979, 80, 81. I did a whole bunch of them. I did a few of them I did on phone, by the phone. There were some people, of course, who were in New York, like, for example, Felix Knight, who was Tom Tom in Babes in Toyland. Somehow I got his number, and I was very nervous about calling him because, of course, he'd been in the Metropolitan Opera and famous on radio and made recordings for RCA Victor and was a famous vocal teacher. And here I was, 20 years old from Southern California, cold calling him. So, but I called him and I said, hello, Mr. Knight. My name's Randy Skretvedt. I'm calling from Southern California. I'm doing a research project about Laurel and Hardy, and I was wondering if you might have some time when we could set up an interview to talk about your work on Babes in Toyland. And he says, I'm just watching a ball game. We can do it now. So fortunately, I had the foresight to have all my questions typed up and ready for him in case such an event happened. And I had my tape recorder going, and I got a great hour-and-a-half interview with him. He was a terrific interview, and it just, happened on the spur of the moment over the phone. So sometimes you get lucky that way. But anyway, how did I do research? Well, I discovered the motion picture library, the Margaret Herrick Library at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, which was on Wilshire Boulevard in Beverly Hills. And so during summer vacations from school, I would go up there and go through all the old trade papers. They had bound volumes of hard copy of Film Daily and Hollywood Filmograph and Hollywood Reporter and Exhibitors Herald World, all of these old trade papers with no indexes. And it was just the actual old paper that you looked at. And I would bring my little cassette recorder and just go page by page, hoping to find something on Laurel and Hardy production. And usually I'd come away with maybe 12 to 15 little one-paragraph articles. That would be a good day. Now, of course, we can go on to the Lantern Media History Digital Project website, which is put together by the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And you type into a little search engine and put Laurel and Hardy, and 150,000 articles come to you.
Yes.
And you can be in your kitchen in your pajamas. You don't have to drive to Beverly Hills 4 days a week, 40 miles each way, which is what I had to do back in the olden days. So by cracky, in those pre-internet days, I had to really scratch this stuff out, I'll tell you.
Right.
Yeah, which was why when I, after a while, I said, there's too much new stuff. I have to rewrite Laurel and Hardy, The Magic Behind the Movies, because it's not adequate anymore. So, but it was the best book I could do for 1987.
Right. Well, the more recent book is terrific. I really enjoyed reading it. And I wanted to ask you while we're on that subject, are there still things about Laurel and Hardy after all these years that you haven't figured out yet? Are there still some unanswered questions, or do you
There
feel
were
like...
some that took a long time. For example, whatever happened to Stan's third wife, whose name was Vera Ivanova Shuvalova, and she went professionally under the name of Ilyana, and she was a holy terror. She and Stan were married for just about 2 years. I think he realized about a month into the marriage that this was a big mistake. She liked to get drunk and dance on tabletops at nightclubs, and then go out and just take her car and smash into 3 parked cars and get thrown into jail for it. She was just out of control, this woman. But after she divorced Stan, or he divorced her in 1941, just nothing happened to her. There was one article in a newspaper that I found in 1944 where she was arrested for passing bad checks. But then eventually I found, Ancestry is great. You can find things through Ancestry if you know how to dig and if you know how to follow trails. And even if trails go cold, there's usually a way to go back around and find another part of the trail. Anyway, I found that she had remarried in 1943 to a man whose last name was Long, not Walter Long, who was a supporting player in Laurel and Hardy movies.
Yes.
And she died in 1946 in Bayonne, New Jersey, of some sort of skin cancer or something. And she's buried in Bayonne, New Jersey, under the name of Vera Long. So I finally solved that one. That was a real puzzler. And then there were people in the movies, performers, bit players, that I really wanted to identify. There was a little boy who was in the Laurel and Hardy silent Bacon Grabbers, and he has a big Great Dane dog. And Laurel and Hardy are trying to serve a subpoena to Edgar Kennedy, and they want to borrow the Great Dane dog. So this little boy shows up with it, and they borrow the Great Dane. And then that same boy shows up in the next film, and he's talking with a pet shop owner because the boy has seen the goat, the pet shop owner's goat, disappear. So I said, who is this kid? And I got lucky. I found the 1929 payroll ledgers at USC. And usually anybody who was what they would call a day player like that, who was not a contract actor, they would just, at the end of each week, they would just say extras. And it would be every one of these people who was in any movie that was in production that week, any of the supporting people who were not under contract, and that's most of them. And there was usually no indication as to who was in what picture. But I got real lucky, and there happened to be a specific page for the Bacon Grabbers people, and then a specific page for the Angora Love people. And I was able to figure out that Buddy Moore was the little boy. Wow. And now go through IMDb and you find, oh yes, he was a child actor, and here's when he was born. He made 7 or 8 movies, but that's it. But he did go to a children's professional school for acting, and da 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 da. So now we have wonderful research tools with Ancestry.com, and a lot of people don't like IMDb, and yes, sometimes it does make stupid mistakes, but 90% of it is great. Newspapers.com is terrific. So and the other thing about Ancestry is it can lead you to people who are part of the family of whoever it is that you're looking for. That happened to me with a guy named James Green, who was a sound engineer at the Hal Roach Studios. You see his credit on the music box and several things from 1932 through 1935. And I was looking up James Green, and I found on Ancestry, oh, here's family members. So what happened? How come he doesn't have any credits after 1935? He said, well, the sad story is he was a diabetic, and he was driving home from the Roach studio, and he went into a diabetic coma, and the police picked him up. They thought he was drunk, and they threw him in the drunk tank. And by the time they found out that it was diabetes, it was too late. So he died at age 35, and his wife had just given birth to their 4th child. And she later that year died of surgery on her carotid artery. So both parents gone within the year with 4 children. And so the kids were all parceled out to different relatives. So that's the James F. Green story, Wow. And it's a very sad story, but it is a terrific human interest. And with Magic Behind the Movies and with anything, that's my goal, is these people are not just names on a credit at the beginning of the movie. Everybody has their story.
Right.
And some of them are sad and some of them are hilarious. And by the grace of God and Sons of the Desert, I got to meet and talk to about 60 of these people who worked on these pictures. And of course, you learn all sorts of wonderful human interest things about working at the Roach studio every day that you would never get in any reference book. So, that's the thing that I tried to take the most advantage of while I had that resource of those great people. And everything that I do is really just trying to keep those people alive, as well as keep Laurel and Hardy alive in the culture.
Yes. Well, I think I'll jump topics because there are several things in my notes.
You don't get short answers from me, obviously.
Yes, I know. Well, there are just so many things in my notes that I'm trying to get to. That's okay. I've spoken to you before. I know what you're like.
Okay. You're on to me.
But, yes. Well, you're my friend. It doesn't matter. But I was going to mention that I had Jordan Young on this show a while ago, and he was telling me about your interviewing people from old time radio. So I wanted to ask you about some of the people that you met dealing with that medium.
Well, Jordan is a great mentor of mine. I've known him since I met him through Sons of the Desert. I probably have known him since I was 12, and he has taught me a great many skills. He introduced me to the world of Macintosh computers, and we did a newsletter or a magazine together for 10 years called Pastimes, which covered the entire gamut of popular entertainment from 1900 through 1950. And that was a wonderful experience, and I wish I could still do it. But unfortunately, the internet came along and everybody became a reviewer, and we were a
Right.
quarterly magazine. So it was hard to keep up with all the stuff that was coming out when people on the internet were reviewing it online the day after it was released. So unfortunately, the internet giveth and the internet taketh away, and it tooketh away Pastimes. But anyway, Jordan and I were both big fans of old time radio. We were members of a group called Skretvedt, the Society for the Preservation and Encouragement of Radio, Drama, Variety, and Comedy. They're still going. They have a website. Um, they still publish their magazine, the Spurback Radiogram. And Spurback, from its inception in 1973 or 74, every meeting had a guest from the world of old time radio, and they were very good about tape recording these interviews. I think the first guest was Stan Freberg,
Oh,
but they had all sorts of people all over the years. They have a tremendous archive, not only of shows, um, which in those days were not easily accessible for free and downloadable on the internet because there
right.
was no such thing. We were duping each other's reel to reel tapes in those days. And of course, every time you make a new copy, it's not as good as the previous copy. So the quality of a lot of these copies of shows is not very good. But they were amassing this wonderful library of interviews, and then they started having their annual conventions and banquets, and they'd have lots of people there. So we got to meet these people who, everybody who was in radio loved it and missed it and loved talking about it. And of course, being that they were involved in a vocal art form, they all tended to be very articulate people. So, I don't think I ever had a bad interview with anybody from radio. I think, everybody was just bursting with wonderful stories that they were just eager to tell. So Jordan and I decided that we needed to get these people. Now this is my Brian Wilson smile. This is the thing that I need to get finished before I die. If Jordan and I need to get this finished, we have all these great interviews, and we need to find the magic software where we can plug it in and it will spit out as text. I know such a thing exists because I see the commercials all the time for the hard of hearing telephones where the person on the other end of the line is talking and it spits out as text immediately. So I got to do this for these tapes because we have, I think, 100 different people from all parts of the radio industry. We had sound effects men. We had Ray Erlenborn, who did a lot of the comedy shows, continuing into television. He did Red Skelton, and I think he even did Sonny and Cher. And we had a guy named Bern Surrey, who was the sound effects man on Suspense. And he did the sound effects for Agnes Moorehead for Sorry, Wrong Number,
Hmm.
which is a pretty sound effects intensive show with all the phone noises. And of course, at the end, the train comes in and overdubs and obscures her scream. So she isn't heard screaming. Well, Agnes Moorehead did that show 8 times on Suspense. She did it live every time. They never wanted to play a transcription of a previous performance. So she did it live, and she said, but I have to have Bern Surrey. He's the only guy that I'll do this show with. Well, Bern Surrey, after a couple of years of doing this, had moved on from the world of radio and had become a psychiatrist. And so he had to get special permission from the union to come and do this show for Agnes Moorehead, this one-shot show of Suspense every year when she was doing the new performance of it. And because she insisted, I'm not going to do it if it's not Bern Surrey as my sound man. So we got a wonderful interview with him. He gave us an hour of his time for free, which I'm sure as a psychiatrist, he probably got paid a lot every hour. He also told us about Donovan's Brain, which is a great suspense show, a 2-parter with Orson Welles. And, the brain has been taken from this great man, and it's alive all by itself. And he said, what is the sound that a brain makes? And he hit upon, like a radio wave, an oscillator going to indicate the energy of the brain waves. So anyway, he was a fascinating interview. We talked to all sorts of actors. You would know them from TV shows like Olin Soule, who shows up a lot on Dragnet. He was on the First Nighter program. We talked to the other lead actor of the First Nighter program, Les Tremaine. Lester Maine and Olin Soule have a scene together in North by Northwest, by the way, in the
Oh,
auction scene. They have the two guys who alternated as lead on the first Nighter program. Talked to Willard Waterman, who took over for Harold Peary as the Great Gildersleeve.
yes.
Oh yeah, all sorts of people. June Foray, who of course is probably better known for cartoon voice work, but she did a show. One of her earliest credits in radio was with Steve Allen.
Right.
His first big show was called Smile Time on Mutual in 1946. It was Steve Allen, June Foray, and a guy named Wendell Noble. And uh, I happened to do a phone interview with Steve Allen. I did one for a book that I co-wrote with Jeff and Greg Lenberg about Steve Martin. That was our first book. That came out in 1980. And we did an interview with Steve, and he actually wrote the foreword for it, a very funny one, because he had given Steve one of his first TV shots. And of course, being someone who is a great historian of comedy himself, Steve Allen had a good perspective on Steve Martin and how he was new from other comedians. I then interviewed him on phone for an article about Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis being on his show. And after that, I said, you know, I'm doing this project about radio. I want to talk to you sometime about Smile Time. And he said, do you have any of those? And I said, I've got about a half a dozen of them. And I think I sent him copies of those. And I said, but, you know, when you have time, I know you're doing 12 projects at the same time, but I'd like to talk to you about Smile Time. So about 3 days later, I get a call from one of Steve's secretaries at Meadow Lane Enterprises. And she says, Steve wants to know when you want to talk about Smile Time. So that's the first time that I've ever had a celebrity call me to ask when it was convenient for me to talk to him. My goodness. So he was about the most generous and sweetest guy you would ever meet in the world, Steve Allen was. Despite his incredible creativity and output, he always made time for you. He was a very, very nice guy. We also got to interview George Burns by phone. And that's another thing where we were supposed to have 20 minutes. This was in 1990. And George was still very busy doing the occasional movie, and he was still performing all over the country and doing country and Western record albums and writing books. And he had a secretary named Jack Langdon. And Jack came on. He said, okay, well, you can talk to George about radio, but I can only give you 20 minutes. Okay, fine. So we had our best questions first so that we got those answered first. And 20 minutes went by, 25 minutes went by, 30 minutes went by, 40 minutes went by. George was still having so much fun talking about radio. And finally, Jack Langdon comes on the line and says, George, you got other people you got to deal with today, so I got to cut this off. He said, oh, okay. And I said, George, by the way, before we go, I have a copy of the first record that you and Gracie made in 1928 in England before you were on radio. And he says, oh, I don't have a copy of that. Could you make a tape of that for me? Sure. So I made him a 90-minute cassette of that and other odd Burns and Allen things. They did a record together in 1955 that was only a promo record for George's first book called I Love Her, That's Why. And it's charming. It's a musical, a song with full orchestration. It's wonderful, never commercially released. I did a bunch of the songs that Gracie sang on the late 30s episodes of Burns and Allen because she used to have a song every show. Other oddball things, guest appearances. So I sent it to him, and a few days later, I got a wonderful letter from him thanking me for it. And he said it brought back so many happy memories, things I'd forgotten about. And he said, since you live so close, come by sometime and we'll have a cigar. Well, I knew he was probably going to be too busy for that. But anyway, I cherished that letter, and he was a very, very nice guy. So, I mean, that's the great thing is you get to, they always say, never meet your idols. Well, I've never had a bad experience with that. People whom I loved who were from radio or music or Laurel and Hardy, many of them became cherished friends. And they're almost all gone now, of course, but I have lots of tapes and Christmas cards and that sort of thing as mementos, and I try to keep them all alive in whatever way I can.
Yeah, those are great stories. Thanks again for sharing that. And well, I guess there's one other category I was going to mention. I know we're both cartoon fans, and you mentioned June Foray. Did you meet other people involved in animation? Did you meet Mel Blanc or Chuck Jones or people like that?
Well, I certainly am not Jerry Beck. Jerry Beck, who is a wonderful guy, is the Kevin Brownlow. What Kevin Brownlow is to silent films, I think Jerry Beck is to animation.
Yes.
Oh gosh, you know, any great DVD or book, he's got his name in there prominently if he's not the author of it.
Sure.
Not so many people in animation. I did, however, have a couple of very nice encounters with Bob Clampett.
Ah,
Back in the early to mid 70s, I was very heavy into Super 8 film collecting because we didn't have video just yet. And I wrote for a magazine called Private Screenings. So when I was in high school, I was writing for this magazine, which is a very professionally produced thing called Private Screenings. In fact, I had a high school teacher. I showed him the issue that had a big article from me. And he says, "Randy Skretvedt, I hate you." So why? Because you got published before I did. I said, well, I'm friends with the guys who run the magazine. I think that probably had something to do with it. But it was a magazine about Super 8 and 16 millimeter film collecting. And in fact, we had a correspondent in London named Paul Van Summeren, because there were lots of films you could get on Super 8 in England that you couldn't get over here because of rights issues. You could get MGM Tom and Jerry cartoons in England. You could get Warner Brothers cartoons on Super 8 Sound in England that you couldn't get over here. So it so happened when I was 17, my parents and I took a 3-week vacation to Europe, and I made sure that during our 4 days in London, I set up a meeting with Paul Van Summeren. And so we talked about our Elmo Super 8 projectors and things that you could get in England that you couldn't get here. And so I got a great interview for Private Screenings. So anyway, Bob Clampett was, I don't know who had his address, but somebody did. In fact, my next door neighbor had been in the Army with Bob Clampett and used to get Christmas cards from him of Beanie and Cecil, and would show me that every Christmas. So I thought that was really cool. But we had a little meeting together of some of our Super 8 and 16 millimeter collector friends. And we said, well, we've all got some Bob Clampett cartoons. Why don't we just get him down here and talk with him? Sure. So there probably were only 15 or so of us. It wasn't a big crowd. But he came down. He was wearing his little powder blue suit and had his jet black dyed hair.
right.
And came down, and we showed Falling Hair, the one with the gremlin with
Yep.
Bugs Bunny. And I think somebody had a copy of Book Review, which is the great Daffy Duck one with all of the caricatures of contemporary celebrities. And Daffy does his impression of Danny Kaye,
Right.
doing his rapid fire gibberish. And, we showed maybe a half dozen cartoons, and he would talk about each one. I wish I had a tape of that. I don't have a tape recording of that. But I saw him there. And then he called me one time trying to find the name of the guy who was the original voice actor for Porky Pig. And I wish to this day that I had known Joe Doherty. That's the name of the guy
Yep.
who really stuttered. And they had to get rid of him because he was burning up so much film actually trying to get the lines out. The poor guy, he really did have a terrible stammer. So that's why they got Mel Blanc, who controlled it and could do everything within a reasonable amount of time. But anyway, I wouldn't say I was close to Bob Clampett, but I had a couple of memorable encounters with him, and I talked from time to time to his daughter, who's on Facebook.
Right.
I have a nice letter from Dawes Butler because I was getting interested in voice acting. He sent me a cassette tape, which was sort of his crash course in voice acting, with a nice letter. And I sent a letter to Tex Avery. I knew a guy through Sons of the Desert, one of my Laurel and Hardy people. His name was Roy Seawright. Roy was the special effects guy at the Hal Roach Studios. He'd worked there from 1919 through the late 40s. He started out as Hal Roach's office boy and became the animator and cartoonist and then the optical effects guy at Roach's, and then started his own company called Cascade Pictures, which was the first company that made animated cartoons as commercials for TV. And one of the people that he hired was Tex Avery. So in 1976, like I say, my parents and I had been to Europe. In Geneva, Switzerland, they were doing a Tex Avery festival. And this is really before Tex Avery was, the animation god that he is now. He was still not terribly well known in the USA. But in the newspaper, I opened it up and it's a 2-page spread, Tex Avery, and had, great pictures of Screwy Squirrel and Junior and George and everything. It was in French. And I said, I got to get a couple of copies of this. I'm going to send this to Tex. I'll bet he'd be thrilled. So I got Tex Avery's address from Roy Seawright. I wrote him a very polite letter saying, Mr. Avery, I love your work. Whenever I see a Screwy Squirrel cartoon or George and Junior, I always stop what I'm doing and watch it because these are very special cartoons. I appreciate the love and the care that you put into these things. And it just so happened that I was with my parents in Geneva a couple of weeks ago. They were running a festival of your films. Enclosed is a newspaper. I thought you might enjoy having it. Well, I never did hear back from him, and come to find out from other people who were closer to Tex that he did not know how to handle praise. He just did not know how to handle thank you. So basically any fan mail that he got, he either didn't read it or read it and threw it away. So I don't know if he did keep that newspaper article. It certainly was impressive because, like I say, it was a full 2-page spread, all devoted to him and his films, just in a just normal everyday newspaper. It wasn't a film magazine or anything.
Hmm.
So anyway, that was my attempt at contacting the great Tex Avery. So that didn't happen. But and I think I saw Chuck Jones a couple of times because he was based in Orange County in Newport Beach, and there's still the Chuck Jones Museum and Activities Center in Orange County. So he has a lot of ties that are not too very far from where I live.
Yeah.
So I don't have a lot of stories about cartoon people, but of course, a lot of the radio people became cartoon voices
Right.
also. And there's a wonderful guy in Australia named Keith Scott,
Yes.
who became he became the next Bill Scott. He filled in for Bullwinkle. He does a great Bullwinkle. He's a very talented voice actor, and he's written a mammoth 2-volume history of radio voice actors. Who biographies of them, and then listing basically every cartoon ever made of who does the voices. And
Right.
because they're not credited, he really had to scratch out those credits. But it's a terrific double volume for anybody who's interested in that.
Yes, I don't know Keith personally, but I'm certainly a fan and admirer of his. So, yeah,
Well, I have had the pleasure. He did come down here from Australia to LA a few years ago, and I did have a wonderful afternoon with him. He's a terrific guy.
I'm sure he is. Yeah. Well, yeah, again, I'm glad I had you on this show because I've not heard a lot of these stories before. And I've,
I got a million of them, a million of them.
yeah. Oh, I did say I was going to lead back into talking about your radio shows. We didn't get back to that.
Okay.
And you did talk about how you got started, but you want to sort of continue talking about forward into the past?
Well, I'm very blessed to continue to be doing it. Nobody has ever said you can't play that or whatever. I am careful about certain things. I don't play Amos and Andy, for
Right,
example, but I'm on every Sunday live from 2 to 5 Pacific time. So work that out for yourself, whatever time zone you happen to be in. But I'm on Sunday from 2 to 5, and it's KSPC in the Los Angeles area. You can pick it up on the actual radio at 88.7 FM. And otherwise, all around the world, you can get it at www.kspc.org. K Space. We are the space from Claremont, California, Pomona College. And like I say, I've never made a dime from radio. I've been on radio practically every week since 1977, but have always done it as a part of a community volunteer basis. I also do part of a show called The Sunset Review with my friend Roger Allen, and I do about 60 character voices. There's where the cartoon character voice thing comes back into play.
right.
So I do Oliver Phelps, who started the town stage. And I do Percival Heavens, who's sort of the town snoop.
And I do little Billy Freddy, who's a little kid, 6 years old.
I do a whole bunch of I do 60 different voices. And that is something that if I wanted to make some money, that's something I would love to get into because now everybody's doing it from home. I didn't get into it before because I said I don't want to have to slog up to LA back and forth to do auditions and callbacks. I don't have the stamina to do it. But now it seems like everybody's doing voice work from home. So who knows? Even though I'm 66 years old, I still have a lot of years left. Both of my parents made it to their late 90s. So I figure I've got another 30 years left. We will see what we will see.
Yeah, I've done some voice work myself and written and produced radio shows, so maybe I could write a part for you sometime.
Good. I'd be happy to do it.
Yeah.
I do also. God blessed me with a very middle of the road voice, so I can go high, low, young, old, and do lots of different accents. And I've taken every vocal training course in the world because when I was a very little boy, I had a little lisp. I used to say my S's like this, and someone had to tell me how to properly say an S so I don't put my tongue under my teeth. So, so I did that. I did oral interpretation classes. I did speech competitions. I had actual DJ work. That was fun because this is in college when I was at KBPK for Fullerton College. Kids would come in at the beginning of the semester and they go, well, I want to be on radio because I think it'd be really cool to play records, and be a DJ. And, that's what I want to do. And then they would learn the tricks of the trade so well that by the end of the semester, they're going, Well, I've got another class now. I'll see you guys later because they sounded like this all the time. They didn't know how to turn off that DJ voice, so they were professional announcers. You know, so you can overdo it as well. So
Yeah.
I try to find. I've just finished doing commentaries for. Here's another thing for 1929 year 3 of Laurel and Hardy, a forthcoming Blu-ray. I've been working on 2 projects at the same time. We have the 3rd volume of the Laurel and Hardy Silence. This will finish up the Silence. This is for Flicker Alley, and Serge Bromberg at Lobster Films in Paris is putting it together with the help of some people here at Blackhawk Films in Burbank. They are coordinating. This has been amazing. They've had to piece together these movies, these Laurel and Hardy films, because these films were loved to death. They've been printed and reprinted and reprinted and reprinted. And the people who were the corporate successors to the Hal Roach Studios, their philosophy always was, and Hal Roach's himself was, who's interested in these old things? And certainly, and you would think by 1960, when Laurel and Hardy had been on TV for 12 years, and there were still new people putting Laurel and Hardy on TV, you would think that somebody would have said, let's put a little money into preserving this library and not keep reprinting these same negatives and splicing and putting in slugs and things when things break. The library was in absolute tatters because Hal Roach's idea always was, I'm interested in what I'm doing today and tomorrow. I couldn't care less about yesterday, which is why it was amazing that he made himself so accessible to, college age film researchers like me, but he did. Anyway, Serge Bromberg and company are piecing together these silent films and getting the best materials available from all over the world, and some of them are just absolutely spectacular. And I have been blessed to do the commentaries on a bunch of them. So I finished doing 2 commentaries yesterday for the silent version of Birthmarks, which was also released as a talkie, and they're also going to include the Huskow. So I did commentaries for that yesterday, and I do a lot of work on these. I've gotten some very nice comments about them because I really work on those commentaries. I watch the film 4 times and make notes, and then I go back to all of my research and everything and try to put in whatever the great stories are about the making of the film, and then I try to get all of that in during the running time of the film. So I work very hard on those commentaries, but I get some nice comments about them. So anyway, I've got that coming out. I've got, I think, 6 or 7 commentaries on the 1929, and I have another 6 or 7 on the other project, which is Definitive Restorations Volume 2, and that's several of the talkie shorts, which now look absolutely gorgeous. It's just amazing where some of this material has been hiding for 90 odd years, because we've seen these things in terrible 16 millimeter prints or worse for years and years and years and years. And now all of a sudden, here they are in stunning 35 millimeter. Not just, it's not only the sharpness, it's also the extra picture area. You realize over the years how much has been cropped from printing and printing and printing, how much has been cropped out of the frame. So these are really going to be a revelation, both of these sets, when they come out, and I'll be blathering all over them. You can watch them with my commentary if you haven't gotten enough of me already.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I actually didn't buy the first 2 sets because I was waiting until number 3 came out, and then I could buy them together.
Well, get them while you can. I learned very quickly with regard to things like reissues of vintage music on LP and CD. Get them if you can afford it. Get it as soon as you can, because these things don't last long, and they don't make that many copies of them. I was shocked to learn that most of these reissue CDs, they make 1,500 copies, and that's it. They don't make them in 20 or 30 or 40,000. They make 1,500 of them, and that's why they go out of print very quickly. And if you can find a used one, good luck, because that's all there's going to be. So, a lot of these CDs of vintage recordings are actually rarer than the old 78s that they are preserving. So, so get them while you can.
Yeah, well, I may have made a mistake then, but
you can still get 1927 and 1928, but I wouldn't dilly-dally.
Okay,
I know they're on a second pressing of the 1927 one.
Well, I'll take your advice then. I'll try to get them.
Yep.
And then when Volume 3 comes out, I'll get that. So there you go.
The definitive restorations right now, somebody's got a big discount on it if you pre-order it. So
good.
Take advantage of it.
So let's see. It's been about an hour, but there are a couple of other things I wanted to get to. Well, as you know, I teach film history for a living, and in my research, I read that that was something that you did at one point in your career. So I wanted to know about that.
I was a classroom teacher from 2000 through the end of 2004 at the Long Beach School for Adults. I was already affiliated with them because uh, every Friday night they had the Friday Film Festival. And my dear friend Rob has a huge collection of movies. Back then it was on Laserdisc. Now it's and VHS. Now it's VHS, Laserdisc, DVD, and Blu-ray. And of course, I go back to the Super 8 days. So we both are big collectors of movies, and we wanted to have a forum to share these things. And so here was a teacher at the Long Beach School for Adults who every Friday night put this together, and we wound up having 50 people enjoying our movies. I would write up the program notes, and I would supply the short subjects because I had more of those than Rob did. So I wish we had such a video right now. We're going to have to try and find a place to share because we have even more movies now. But we did this for I think 17 years,
Wow.
and during that time I got to meet the guy who was the head principal of the Long Beach School for Adults, and I said, I had film history classes in college that were part of my English requirement. Could you do that for School for Adults? He said, absolutely. And so I became a teacher of film history to mainly these were kids who were studying for their GED. They should have graduated high school, but didn't for a variety of reasons. I had one brilliant student, a young man who had to leave high school because he had a brain tumor.
Oh,
But happily, the surgery was entirely successful. He was fine, but he was 19 years old and he was out of high school, so he had to get a GED. But it was great because these were kids who, at first, black and white was like kryptonite.
right.
I don't want to see black and white. And I had to say, well, you can do things with black and white that you can't do with color. And I'm going to show you some movies that are beautifully photographed in black and white, which you could not do in color.
Right.
And I said, in fact, there are people today who make films in black and white as an artistic decision. And there have been several films in recent years made in black and white. I said, you can control the lighting, you can control other things, which you can't really do in color. So anyway, I was an 18-week course that I did twice a year, and 9 weeks were devoted to specific directors, and 9 weeks were devoted to particular categories of films. So we covered comedy, musicals, silence, film noir, different westerns, and then directors would be people like John Ford and Orson Welles and Howard Hawks, and so they got a nice crash course in vintage film. Almost all of the films that I showed were from the 30s through the mid 50s, although I usually would start off the class with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid because it's in color, so they weren't going to be scared of it. Part of it is in Spanish because I had a lot of kids where English was their second language, and it's funny and dramatic all at the same time. So it was a good introduction and kind of eased them into a world of more vintage movies, because of course that movie itself now is 56 years old or so. So that's an old movie. When I was getting into the world of old movies, they were 30 years old. I knew as a little kid that the Laurel and Hardy movies had been made 30 years earlier. But so anyway, my goal is to get them to learn about certain things that are still vital in the culture. I was surprised that several of them had never seen The Wizard of Oz. And in fact, I actually did have some students who were adults. And I had a couple of them who were in their 50s and 60s who had never seen The Wizard of Oz. I said, really? It was on every year on television for many years. I said, I always thought it was just a kid's movie. So, well, and it's a movie for big kids too. So I showed it to them. And of course, so much of it is Burt Lahr and Jack Haley and Ray Bolger, these baggy pants comedians doing all sorts of shtick all the way through it. They said, hey, that was really good. And I said, yeah, it is really good. It's not just it's not My Little Pony. There's more to it than your average kids movie. So anyway, that was a great experience being able to get up there and talk. And as you know, I have a talent for talking to kids about this and try to maybe incur a little bit of enthusiasm for these things. And actually, I did have a couple of students saying, can you get these things on video? Because these are great. These are better than movies they make now. And I said, thank you for saying that. I want to give you an automatic A's right now so badly. So that's my goal, is to have kids say that they really enjoy these films, and in fact they're better than some of the movies they make now, because movies now are basically a thrill ride.
Right.
I like movies that actually have a story and some interesting characters to them. So yeah, I did that for 4 years, and would welcome the opportunity to do it again if I can get kids to put their phones down
Right.
and pay attention. That's always the obstacle now.
Yeah, you're making me think about something that I've talked about on this show before, which is I think some of those old movies are starting to go. I think probably a lot of younger people don't know who Laurel and Hardy are anymore,
Oh yeah.
or Humphrey Bogart or any of these people that we know and love. So,
Mhm.
and I know there's some younger people like myself or people slightly younger than me. So, do you think there's much hope for the future in terms of keeping this stuff alive?
It's certainly available. There's not only the Turner Classic Movies. There's the Movies exclamation point channel. I was just looking at it earlier today. They were showing "I Wake Up Screaming" with Betty Grable and Laird
Yes.
Krieger. So these things are available. The thing is, when I was a kid, and when you were a kid, probably, uh, we still had late night movies before the advent of the infomercial, and they were everywhere. And now, you would just bump into them. I remember the first time I saw Citizen Kane. I was 11 years old. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon. I was cooped up in the house. I turned on the TV, and they're in the middle of the newsreel. And I could tell that it was not a real newsreel, but it was a really, really well done fake, because they had the shot of Kane with Teddy Roosevelt on the back of the train. And I was going, wow, they even scratched up the film to make it look like actual 1910 film. What is this? And then they go to the shot of the screen and the projection image, and the sound goes, and then they have the scene in the room after they've watched the newsreel with the beautiful shadow and the lighting. I said, I don't know what this is, but I've never seen a movie that looks like this. I'm going to watch this. I was just so absolutely enthralled immediately by the photography. And I said, I don't know what this is, but I got to watch it. And that's how I stumbled onto Citizen Kane. I don't know if kids do that now, because now it seems like we have so many choices with streaming and a bazillion TV stations. You really have to search things out. I think they're there for the searching, even more so than when we were kids. But you have to be looking for them.
Right.
But the opportunity is still there for people to learn. I mean, we're in a golden age right now. It probably won't last too much longer. But as far as Blu-rays and things are concerned, there's all manner of things that are readily available, dirt cheap. I mean, I can buy all the Laurel and Hardy shorts on DVD for like $40. When I was buying Super 8 film, a Laurel and Hardy two-reel talkie in 1971 was $26.98 in 1971 dollars. And to be able to get the whole shebang for $40, or you can buy all the Three Stooges two-reelers on Columbia in a box set for about $50.
Right.
Those were $39 a short when I was collecting them in the 70s. So the availability is certainly there. It's just we have to get people to know how wonderful these films are, that despite their age, they're still very vital. And we're still listening to Mozart, and we're still listening to Beethoven, and we still have Shakespeare.
Yes.
So certain things are timeless. And as long as we just make them available, and if we teach them, I think kids will wake up and become interested in it, as you're doing. And also with regard to comedy, I've been to several screenings in recent years in theaters of Laurel and Hardy films with these new restorations, and parents bring their kids along. And it's wonderful. These are kids who are 6 and 7 years old, and it's great to hear the adults laughing, but to hear the shrill laughter of the kids on top of it, screaming with laughter,
Yes.
going, yeah, we're getting a new generation. All right. Because it doesn't matter to kids if they're 7 years old. It doesn't matter that they're black and white and not widescreen. What's funny is funny.
Right. Well, that's probably an appropriate place to end, I think. Is
All
there
right.
anything else coming up that you want to promote?
Oh, well, just continuing to do Sunset Review and Forward into the Past on radio, and look for the 1929 Year 3 from Flicker Alley, and Definitive Restorations Volume 2 from Kit Parker Films. And goodness only knows what'll happen. I hope I can do another volume of Laurel and Hardy's scripts. I've done 2 books
Yes.
of the original scripts. And earlier this year, I spent much too much money on about a half a dozen scripts of Laurel and Hardy films that I didn't have. I'm always on the lookout for more scripts, particularly of the shorts. And I have several of the features which I haven't done as book form yet. So I hope that Dave Koenig at Bonaventure Press might be amenable to doing those as books in the future. We'll see, and maybe I'll even get the radio book out before too much longer. So I got a lot of potential irons in the fire.
Yeah, well, good luck with everything. And
Thank you. You too.
yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure to have you here, Randy. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you, Andrew. I'll be happy to do it again anytime you want.
Sure, I'm happy to have you back, pal.
Thank you. You take care.
You too.
Mm.